The rain had started just as the delivery truck rumbled down the street, its headlights cutting through the dense October fog. Amelia Sinclair stood at the window, watching the headlights flicker as the truck slowed, finally stopping in front of their house. She hadn't expected any deliveries, certainly not at this hour, and especially not from anyone she knew. Mark, her husband, was still at work, and Sophie was upstairs, likely lost in one of her drawings. For a moment, Amelia wondered if it was all a mistake. But then, two men in worn, rain-slicked jackets climbed out of the cab and began walking toward her porch. A knock at the door rattled the windows. She hesitated for a moment, her hand hovering over the knob before pulling it open. "Delivery for Sinclair," one of the men grunted, water dripping from his cap. "I didn't order anything," Amelia replied, eyeing the massive object wrapped in tarpaulin on the back of the truck. "Not from you," the man said. "From an estate, upstate. You're listed as the nearest living relative. Look, we just hauled the stuff, lady. It's a piano." His tone was final, and before Amelia could protest, the two men began heaving the object down from the truck, their boots clomping up the porch steps. "A piano?" she whispered to herself, confusion prickling the back of her neck. She hadn't touched a piano in years, not since Sophie was born. But here it was, hers apparently, whether she wanted it or not. The movers struggled but managed to wedge the piano into the hallway. They pulled the covering off with one swift motion, revealing a grand upright that had clearly seen better days. Its once glossy black surface was dulled, scratched, and worn. Faint carvings, barely visible beneath layers of dust, ran along the edges, intricate, unsettling patterns that looked more like runes than decoration. The keys were yellowed with age, and several were chipped. Yet, despite its condition, the piano radiated a strange kind of presence, as though it had been waiting for her all along. "Sign here," the second man muttered, thrusting a clipboard into Amelia's hands. She hesitated, her eyes lingering on the piano. Something about it made her skin crawl, though she couldn't place why. But she signed anyway, feeling a sudden urgency to get the men out of her house. Once the movers had left, she stood in silence, staring at the piano as the wind howled outside. The house felt heavier now, as if the very air had thickened with the instrument's arrival. "Mom?" Sophie's small voice called from the top of the stairs. "Who was that?" "No one, honey. Just a delivery," Amelia replied, trying to keep her tone light. It's a piano." Sophie appeared at the landing, clutching her sketchbook to her chest. Her eyes flicked to the piano and then back to her mother. "I don't like it," she said quietly. Amelia's stomach tightened. She didn't like it either. "It's just old. Probably needs tuning," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "Go on, finish your drawing before bed." Sophie lingered for a moment longer, her gaze fixed on the piano, before nodding and disappearing back upstairs. Amelia turned back to the instrument, her fingers twitching with an old instinct to play, despite the unease growing in the pit of her stomach. Tentatively, she reached out and pressed one of the keys. The note that followed was deep and resonant, far too rich for an instrument so weathered. It echoed through the room, lingering longer than it should have, filling the space with a sense of something unfinished, something waiting. She stepped back, wiping her hands on her jeans, as if trying to rid herself of the note's lingering vibration. She would deal with it tomorrow, maybe call a tuner to look at it, anything to push aside the uneasy feeling. As she turned to head upstairs, the house settled into silence once more. But just as she reached the top of the stairs, a sound stopped her cold. From below, from the very room she had just left, the piano began to play again. And this time, no one was touching the keys. Amelia froze, gripping the banister, her heart thudding in her chest. She strained to listen, praying the sound was only in her imagination. But no, there it was again. The piano was playing. A slow, delicate melody drifted through the house, eerily beautiful yet profoundly unsettling. The notes were soft, like a lullaby, but with each passing second the music grew darker, shifting into strange, dissonant chords that grated against her nerves. Amelia's mouth went dry. The logical part of her brain screamed for an explanation, perhaps a draft, or the old mechanics of the piano were somehow sticking. But she knew better. There was no rational reason for an unmanned piano to play itself, especially not one that had sat silent for decades. Her feet felt heavy as lead, but she forced herself to descend the stairs, her hand gripping the railing so tightly her knuckles turned white. As she reached the bottom step, the melody abruptly stopped. The house fell into a suffocating silence, the only sound the distant patter of rain against the windows. Amelia stood frozen, staring at the piano from across the room. Nothing moved. She took a slow step forward. The air around the piano seemed to hum with an invisible energy, as if the room itself was alive, waiting for her to make the next move. She edged closer, her pulse pounding in her ears, until she was standing right in front of the instrument. The keys lay still, silent as they should be, yet something about them felt expectant. Amelia's breath came out in a shallow puff as she reached toward the keys, her fingers hovering just above them. The memory of the first note she had played earlier that evening resurfaced, how it had lingered too long, how it had felt wrong. She hesitated. Then, in a moment of reckless curiosity, she pressed down on a single key. The sound was immediate, a low, vibrating hum that thrummed deep in her bones. But this time she couldn't pull her hand away. Her fingers seemed glued to the key, and as she tried to lift them, the rest of the keys shifted, moving on their own. The piano came alive beneath her touch, playing a series of broken, erratic notes that clashed horribly, like a cry for help that couldn't find the right voice. Amelia yanked her hand back, stumbling away from the instrument, her breathing ragged. But the piano didn't stop. The keys moved as if someone, or something, was seated at the bench, invisible hands guiding them. The same melody from earlier crept back into the room, low and menacing, and she could feel the weight of it pressing down on her chest. What is this?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the haunting tune. Suddenly, Sophie's voice cut through the darkness. "Mom?" Amelia spun around to find her daughter standing in the doorway of the living room, eyes wide, her sketchbook clutched tightly to her chest. "Sophie, get back upstairs." Amelia's voice shook with fear, but Sophie didn't move. Her gaze was fixed on the piano, her face pale as she took a slow, deliberate step forward. "It's playing," Sophie said, her voice eerily calm. "It's playing the song from my dreams." A chill ran down Amelia's spine. "What do you mean, from your dreams?" Sophie turned to her, her eyes dark with something Amelia couldn't quite place, something far too old for a child of 9. "I hear it when I sleep. The piano plays and there's someone singing." She paused, her voice dropping to a whisper. "But they're not happy. They're angry, Mom." Amelia's blood ran cold. How could Sophie know? The piano had only arrived hours ago. Her mind raced for explanations, but nothing made sense. Sophie had never mentioned dreams like this before, and yet her daughter stood there, as if she had always known about the music now filling their home. Without warning, the piano's melody shifted again, this time crashing into a cacophony of jarring, discordant notes. It sounded like screaming. The room darkened, shadows creeping up the walls as the temperature plummeted. Amelia grabbed Sophie's hand and pulled her back toward the stairs. "We're leaving. Now." But just as she turned to flee, the music stopped, leaving the house in a thick, oppressive silence. The sudden quiet was almost worse than the sound. Amelia's heart pounded in her chest as she backed away, Sophie still clutching her hand. As they reached the top of the stairs, Amelia chanced one last look at the piano. The keys were still, but she could feel something watching her from within its polished depths. Something far older and far darker than a simple heirloom. Sophie's voice trembled beside her. "Mom, it's not going to stop, is it?" Amelia didn't answer. She wasn't sure she wanted to know the truth. The following days passed in a blur of unease. Amelia tried to carry on as usual, but something in the house had shifted since the piano's arrival. Every room felt colder, darker, as though the walls themselves had drawn closer. Sophie had grown quieter, more withdrawn, and Mark, busy with work, didn't seem to notice how often their daughter's eyes would linger on the piano, watching it as if waiting for something. Amelia, on the other hand, couldn't stop noticing. The piano's silence felt more oppressive than when it had played on its own. The air around it always felt heavy, charged with an unseen energy that seemed to hum just below the surface. She couldn't shake the feeling that at any moment it would start playing again, summoning that eerie, discordant melody that had filled her with dread. Mark came home late one evening, his footsteps heavy on the porch. He dropped his bag by the door and glanced around, his brow furrowed as he noticed Amelia staring at the piano again. "You've been on edge lately," he said, walking over to her. "It's just an old piano. We should probably sell it or get rid of it if it's creeping you out this much." Amelia opened her mouth to agree. She wanted the thing out of her house, out of her life. But the words didn't come. For reasons she couldn't explain, she felt tied to the piano now, as if it had anchored itself in her home. "Maybe," she murmured, her eyes flicking back to the instrument. I don't know." Mark ran a hand through his hair. "Have you had it tuned yet? It's probably full of loose parts. That could explain the noises." Amelia shook her head. She hadn't called anyone. In truth, she was terrified of what they might find. "You're working too hard," Mark said softly, wrapping an arm around her. "It's just a piano, babe. What's the worst that could happen?" Amelia's stomach tightened at the question, but before she could respond, Sophie appeared at the bottom of the stairs, clutching a small stuffed bear in her arms. Her eyes were wide and she looked pale. Too pale. "Mom? Dad?" Her voice trembled and she glanced nervously toward the piano. "I can't sleep. It's playing again." Amelia's breath caught in her throat, and she shot a glance at Mark. He frowned, then shook his head. "Sophie, it's late. The piano's not playing?" "It is," Sophie insisted, her voice rising in panic. "It's just quieter now. I hear it in my room." Amelia's blood ran cold. Sophie had said something similar before, and it hadn't made sense then either. But tonight, her daughter's fear was undeniable. She knew the melody. She had heard it in her dreams, and now it was haunting her every waking moment. Mark knelt down, trying to comfort Sophie, but Amelia could see the confusion in his eyes. "Sweetheart, maybe you're just having bad dreams." "It's not a dream," Sophie cried. "It's real. There's a woman. She's trying to talk to me. but the music won't let her. The room seemed to darken, the shadows in the corners deepening as Sophie's words lingered in the air. Amelia felt a chill race up her spine, and the tension between them mounted like a storm ready to break. "Sophie, what do you mean?" Amelia asked, her voice tight. "What woman?" Sophie's eyes filled with tears. "I don't know. I don't see her, but I feel her. She's trapped inside the music, and she's angry. She doesn't want to be here." Mark stood, his face pale now too. "This is ridiculous, Amelia," he said, trying to keep his voice steady, but Amelia could see the fear creeping into his eyes. "You're letting her get carried away with these stories." "Mark, we need to do something," Amelia whispered, glancing back at the piano. "It's not just Sophie. I've heard it too, and I can't explain it, but something is wrong with that piano." As if on cue, a low, distant hum echoed from the piano. The sound was faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. A single note that lingered far too long, vibrating in the air like a whisper, like a warning. Mark's face drained of color. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, his eyes locked on the piano, his expression one of dawning horror. The sound faded as quickly as it had come, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. But now, the shadows seemed to shift around them, moving in ways they shouldn't, creeping across the floor toward the piano as if drawn to it. Sophie stepped closer to her parents, her voice a trembling whisper. "She's getting stronger." Amelia grabbed Sophie's hand and held it tight, fear prickling across her skin. Whatever was tied to that piano, it wasn't just a trick of the mind. It was real, and it was growing. "We need help," Amelia said, her voice shaking as she stared at the piano. "Before it gets worse." Mark nodded, his gaze still fixed on the instrument. For the first time, he seemed to understand that whatever was haunting their home wasn't going to stop on its own. But the worst part? Amelia had a sinking feeling that it had only just begun. Amelia sat hunched over her laptop, eyes burning from hours of searching. The screen was filled with articles about cursed objects, haunted instruments, and strange phenomena tied to pianos, most of it folklore, legends, or outright fiction. None of it gave her the answer she needed. She glanced at the clock. Nearly midnight. Mark had taken Sophie to her mother's house for the night. After the third time, Sophie woke screaming about the music. Amelia had insisted on staying behind, convinced that the only way to stop this was to understand where the piano had come from. She scrolled through another page, frustration mounting. There was nothing. The delivery paperwork had only listed an estate in upstate New York, a vague reference to a distant relative on her father's side. But no names, no real connection to anyone Amelia could remember. Her family had always been small. Her parents had both passed years ago, and whatever family tree might have existed was nothing more than fragmented stories her father used to tell in passing. But there had to be something. Someone. Amelia's phone buzzed, jolting her out of her thoughts. It was a message from Mark. "How's it going? Found anything?" Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. She hadn't told him about the growing sense of dread she felt with every passing hour, how the shadows in the house seemed to shift in her periphery when she was alone. He didn't need to know that. Not yet. "Still looking," she replied, then put the phone aside and kept searching. She was about to give up when she stumbled across an obscure article in a small-town digital archive. The headline read, "Tragedy at Galloway Estate. Music teacher found dead beside family heirloom." Amelia's breath caught in her throat. She clicked the article, skimming through the details. The Galloway Estate, a sprawling manor in upstate New York, had belonged to a reclusive family known for their eccentricities. In the late 1800s, the youngest daughter, a brilliant but troubled music teacher named Margaret Galloway, had inherited a piano from her late grandmother. Shortly after, Margaret was found dead, her fingers bloodied and bruised, still pressed against the keys. Locals claimed she had been driven mad by the instrument, but the official cause of death had been ruled as suicide. Amelia's stomach churned. The Galloway name rang a faint bell, something her father had mentioned once, years ago. He had spoken about a distant branch of the family, long disconnected from them, but he hadn't gone into details. Could the piano that now sat in her living room be the same one that had haunted the Galloway family? Her hands shook as she dug deeper. The article mentioned how, after Margaret's death, the piano had been passed down through the generations, each owner meeting a similarly tragic end. Mysterious deaths, disappearances, madness. But the trail went cold after the early 1900s, when the estate had fallen into ruin and the piano disappeared from public record. Until now. Amelia's mind raced. That's why it had been sent to her. She was the last living relative, and this cursed heirloom had found its way into her home, bringing with it the horrors that had plagued the Galloways for over a century. She closed the laptop and stood up, the weight of the knowledge pressing down on her. The house felt colder, emptier, the silence oppressive. Amelia glanced toward the living room where the piano sat, a hulking shadow in the dark. She hadn't touched it since that night, but she felt its presence constantly, as though it was always watching, always waiting for her to come closer. The soft creak of a floorboard made her jump. She spun around, eyes scanning the darkened hallway, heart pounding. No one was there, but she could feel it. The same presence that had lingered ever since the piano arrived. She grabbed her phone and dialed the number for a local historian she had found during her search, someone who specialized in cursed objects and occult histories. It rang once, twice, then went to voicemail. She left a frantic message, her voice shaking as she explained the situation, urging them to call her back as soon as possible. As she hung up, a familiar sound began to fill the air. Her blood turned to ice. The piano was playing again. The same haunting melody, soft and distant at first, but growing louder, more insistent. The notes twisted, climbing in pitch and intensity, filling the house with a sound that made her head throb and her skin crawl. Amelia backed away, but the music followed her, swirling around her like a physical force, pulling her toward the piano. Her vision blurred, and she could swear she saw a figure sitting at the bench, hunched over the keys. A woman. Her hair was wild, her face gaunt and pale, her fingers moving furiously across the keys. It was Margaret. It had to be. Amelia's breath came in ragged gasps as the figure turned, her hollow eyes locking onto Amelia's. The woman's mouth opened, but the music drowned out any words, the melody twisting into a cacophony of tortured screams hidden beneath the notes. Amelia staggered back, clutching her head. The music pounded in her skull, relentless, unbearable. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The house fell into a suffocating silence once again, the air thick with dread. The piano stood still, its keys gleaming faintly in the dim light. The figure was gone, but Amelia knew it wasn't over. Whatever was haunting the piano, whatever had driven Margaret and the others to madness, wasn't finished with her yet. And if she didn't find a way to stop it soon, her family would be next. The next morning, Amelia woke with a splitting headache. She had barely slept, the memory of the music and the ghostly figure at the piano haunting her every thought. The piano remained silent now, but its oppressive presence lingered like a dark cloud over the house. Mark had called earlier to check on her, and though she tried to sound normal, her voice trembled, betraying her fear. She had wanted to tell him everything to make him understand the danger, but she couldn't bear the skepticism in his voice. He was still trying to rationalize it all. Loose keys, faulty mechanics, their minds playing tricks. But Amelia knew the truth. The piano was cursed, and the curse was growing stronger with each passing day. That afternoon, Amelia sat in the living room, staring at the piano from across the room. It loomed there, silent and still, yet alive in a way that made her skin crawl. The historian she'd called had never returned her message. She was on her own, but she had to try something. She approached the piano cautiously, her steps slow and deliberate, as if any sudden movement might provoke it. Her fingers twitched at her sides, unwilling to touch the keys. But she needed answers. The piano's history, the curse that had followed it, was tied to her now, and the longer she waited, the worse it would get. Sophie had already been affected, and the thought of losing her daughter to this thing filled her with terror. Amelia sat down at the bench, her heart hammering in her chest. She hesitated, her hands hovering above the keys. The air seemed to thicken, growing heavier with every second. She could feel it, that dark presence, coiling around her like a snake, waiting for her to make a move. Then, with trembling fingers, she pressed down on a single key. The note rang out, low and haunting, vibrating through the air. It echoed for far too long, as if the house itself had absorbed the sound and was amplifying it. Then, before she could react, the rest of the keys began to move on their own. A discordant, furious melody burst forth, as though the piano had been holding back its rage for decades. The notes slammed against each other in rapid succession, chaotic and overwhelming, twisting into something that resembled screams. The music was no longer just eerie. It was violent, filled with a rage that Amelia could feel in her bones. She tried to pull her hands away, but they wouldn't move. Her fingers were locked to the keys as if some invisible force held them there. Panic surged through her. The music swelled, louder and louder, until it felt like the very walls were vibrating, and shadows began to creep across the room. Amelia's breath came in short gasps. The figure from the night before, the ghost of Margaret, flickered into view at the edge of her vision, standing beside the piano now, her eyes wide and filled with fury. Her mouth moved, but the words were drowned out by the relentless music. Amelia's hands ached as the keys forced her fingers to keep playing, the sharp edges digging into her skin. "Stop!" Amelia screamed, though her voice was swallowed by the rising noise. She struggled to pull her hands away, but the piano wouldn't let go. The shadows in the room thickened, swirling around her in dark tendrils, growing larger, more solid. They slithered up the walls, twisting into grotesque shapes that looked almost human but horribly distorted. Faces stretched out from the darkness, faces twisted in agony, mouths wide in silent screams. Amelia's mind raced. This wasn't just a curse. It was a prison. The piano was a vessel, holding the tormented souls of its past victims, trapping them in a cycle of madness and death. And now it wanted her. She yanked her hands free with a desperate cry, stumbling back from the bench. The music cut off abruptly, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. But the shadows remained, hovering in the corners of the room, waiting. Gasping for breath, Amelia backed away from the piano, her body trembling. The air was thick with malevolence, and the sense of being watched was overwhelming. Margaret's ghost still hovered by the piano, her expression sorrowful now, as though pleading for release. Amelia's thoughts raced. She had to do something. But what? How could she stop the curse before it consumed her family? There was no time to wait for answers from historians or experts. Whatever entity controlled the piano was growing stronger, its grip on her mind tightening with each note it played. Sophie was still at her mother's house, safe for now. But for how long? As Amelia stood in the dim light of the living room, her thoughts darkened. There was only one conclusion she could come to. Something had to be done to sever the piano's hold on her family. A terrible suspicion began to bloom in her mind. The piano would never stop unless it was destroyed. But then the worst realization settled in, cold and unforgiving. Destroying it might not be enough. There could be something else, something darker still, hidden beneath the music. Amelia stared at the piano, her mind teetering on the edge of madness as she weighed the dreadful possibilities. Amelia had barely slept. The events of the previous day replayed in her mind like a nightmare she couldn't escape. The violent music, the shadows, the ghost of Margaret Galloway. They were all trapped inside the house with her, and she knew there was only one way out. The piano had to be destroyed, but deep down, Amelia feared that simply breaking it wouldn't sever the bond it had with her family. Mark and Sophie were still at her mother's house, blissfully unaware of what had happened the night before. Amelia hadn't told them the full truth. How could she? Mark would never believe her. And Sophie, well, she already knew too much. The next morning, Amelia stood in front of the piano, a sledgehammer in hand. She had spent all night convincing herself that this was the only option. There was no calling an expert, no waiting for some savior to come. She had to take matters into her own hands. The piano was alive with a dark force, and if she didn't stop it now, it would take everything from her. Her hands shook as she raised the hammer. The house was deathly silent, the air thick with anticipation. The piano, though still, seemed to pulse with malevolence. She could feel it watching her, daring her to strike the first blow. The thought of what might happen after the first swing sent a shiver down her spine. Would it release its power all at once, or would it fight back? Would she unleash something even worse by shattering it? But she had no choice. She couldn't live in fear any longer. Her family couldn't. With a deep breath, Amelia swung the hammer. The metal connected with the piano's gleaming black surface, splintering the wood in an explosion of sound. The crash reverberated through the house, and for a moment, the silence that followed was so complete that Amelia wondered if it had worked. But then, a low hum filled the room, vibrating from the piano's broken body. The melody, that melody, began again, slow at first, the keys moving despite the damage. Amelia's heart leaped into her throat. She swung the hammer again, harder this time, smashing several keys. But even as the keys cracked and splintered, the music grew louder, more discordant. The shadows on the walls began to swirl again, twisting and stretching into grotesque shapes, their distorted faces flickering in and out of view. "Stop!" Amelia screamed, swinging the hammer wildly. She struck the piano again and again, splintering its lid, cracking its frame. But the music only grew more chaotic, the shadows more aggressive. They slithered along the floor, creeping toward her with malevolent intent. The sound was unbearable now, the crashing of the piano's notes blending with the voices, the anguished screams of the souls trapped inside. Margaret's ghost appeared beside the piano, her face a mask of sorrow and desperation. Her lips moved soundlessly, but Amelia could hear her voice in her mind, a whisper cutting through the madness. "You cannot destroy it like this. It is too late." Amelia's heart pounded. She dropped the hammer, staring at the wrecked piano as it continued to play on its own. The music twisted, warping into something darker, something hungry. The shadows began to wrap around her legs, cold and suffocating, pulling her toward the piano. Desperate, Amelia backed away, her mind racing. If she couldn't destroy it, then what? There had to be a way to stop the curse, to sever the bond between the piano and the souls trapped within. Margaret's ghost flickered in front of her again, her eyes filled with sadness. But there was something else, a glimmer of understanding. The music, Amelia realized. The music was the key. Summoning all her courage, Amelia stumbled toward the piano, ignoring the icy hands of the shadows as they grasped at her. She sat at the bench, her trembling fingers hovering over the ruined keys. If she couldn't destroy the piano physically, maybe she could undo the curse through the music itself. Closing her eyes, she let her hands fall on the keys. The moment her fingers touched them, the piano roared to life, the melody surging through her with violent intensity. She felt the dark force trying to pull her in, trying to make her part of it. But Amelia fought back, forcing her hands to move, to change the melody. She played a series of soft, delicate notes, each one clashing with the cursed melody, disrupting its dark rhythm. The shadows recoiled, hissing as the new melody began to take hold. Margaret's ghost stepped closer, her figure solidifying, her face softening as she watched Amelia play. The haunting music that had tormented her family for generations began to unravel, the discordant notes weakening, losing their hold on the house. Amelia's fingers moved faster, her heart racing as she played the melody Margaret had been trying to finish all along, a melody that would bring peace, not torment. The shadows shrieked in fury, but they began to dissolve, their twisted forms unraveling into nothingness. The final note hung in the air, trembling, as the shadows vanished and the room fell silent. Amelia collapsed onto the bench, her hands shaking, tears streaming down her face. The piano was silent now, its power finally broken. Margaret's ghost stood beside it, her face serene for the first time. She nodded once, a silent thank you before fading into the light. The curse was lifted. But as Amelia sat in the empty house, her fingers still trembling, she knew she would never forget the sound of the piano's final, terrible crescendo.